Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching the hardware installation lesson of the CompTIA A+ training course. In this lesson, we're going to be reviewing the procedures for installing various types of hardware components into a computer system. What we're actually going to be doing is installing each of these different components one by one. And by the time this lesson is done, we will have built a computer from the ground up. Not only will you see how the hardware components get installed, but you'll also see how we wire up all of those components up to the motherboard. And by the time this is done, you're going to have a really good idea as to what steps you need to take to get a PC built from scratch. Before we start installing any components in the computer, it's a good idea that we get a good feel for how the computer case works and what types of features it has. So we're going to start looking at the case from the outside, and then we're going to look at it on the inside. Now, to begin with, we're going to look at the front of the computer case, and this happens to be the case that we're using for our demonstration. You'll notice that there are some forward-facing drive bays, and in these spots you can install devices like CD-ROM drives, Blu-ray players, DVD players, maybe even a tape backup drive if that's what you need. There's also a slot here for floppy drives. So on the inside there's going to be a place for us to mount a floppy drive so that it lines up with this particular slot. Now here's your power button for this particular computer. And down here we have some front-mounted USB ports and a headphone jack. So there's going to be a mechanism inside the case that is allowing us to mount those forward-facing ports. Now on the back of the computer, we have a spot for our power supply. We have a spot for our external ports that are embedded on the motherboard. We have a case fan right here that's installed on the inside of the case, and we have some vent ports right here, and these are installed by the manufacturer. Then we've got the external expansion cards, or our adapter cards. These are the different openings for the 4 slots that we have on this particular motherboard. And you're going to see what that looks like when we get inside the case. And then the last thing that you're going to want to identify when you're looking at your case is which of the sides is the one that opens up so that I can gain access to the inside of the computer. And that happens to be this side right here. Or if you're looking at it from this view, it's this side right here, this edge. And right here, this is the button that we're going to push down in order to allow that side to slide right off. So the beautiful thing about this particular case design is that it doesn't require you to insert or remove screws in order to get the side off. It's as simple as just pushing down this lever and the side will slide right off. Now in our first demonstration, we're going to start off by opening up the case and exposing the internals of the case, and we're going to go ahead and discuss how the case is laid out. And just like we did from the outside, we're going to take a look at the front of the case, and we're going to identify where the drive bays are. We're also going to identify where you mount the floppy drive as well as your hard drives. And then we're going to remove the front cover so that it's out of our way while we're installing our components. Then we're going to take a look at the back of the case, and we're going to take a look at where the expansion slots go. We're going to take a look at the port openings that have to line up with the motherboard, and we're going to take a look at the power supply bay. And then finally, we're going to identify where the holes are in the case that the motherboard itself is going to mount to. Where are we going to screw that motherboard down to the case? Well, we're going to identify those holes in this demonstration. Let's take a look at the inside of our case. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to remove the side panel from the computer case so that we can get on the inside of the case. If you remember when we were looking at the back of the case, there was this lever that released the side panel. So by pushing down on it, we can slide the side panel right off the computer. Now you'll see that there are several areas inside the computer case. To begin with, we've got the expansion slots right here, so you'll have things like sound cards and network cards, etc. will be all mounted into your expansion slots on the motherboard. We've also got places where the external ports that are embedded on the motherboard will line up so that we can get external access to them. We've got a bay for the power supply that's going to be mounted right here. We've got some front-facing bays for your CD-ROM drives and DVD players. And then there's another section here where we're going to be mounting a cage that holds the floppy drive, if of course you're using a floppy drive. And then there are a couple of areas here internally where we're going to be mounting bays this way for hard drives. Now we also have areas right here where the screws go on,
And this is where the motherboard actually mounts to the back of the case. And then we also have the front here that we're going to need to remove because we want to be able to mount some things and adjust them from the front of the computer. So we're just going to push down on this tab, and then the front of the case just easily comes off, and you can set that off to the side until you're done putting everything in.
Now it's time to mount the motherboard in the case. Now when we do that, one of the first steps we're going to do is we're going to orient the motherboard into the case so that we have an idea as to how it's going to sit. Then what we're going to do is identify where the mounting holes are. Some cases come with a bunch of additional mounting holes so that they can actually take different motherboards. So we need to find out which of the holes are going to work for our particular motherboard. Now, depending upon the case that you're using, you may need to insert riser fittings. That's what these things are right here. They're these little devices that screw into the holes that we're going to be using to mount our motherboard, and then on the top of these things there's actually another hole here that the motherboard screw would go into. So they're just to raise the motherboard a little bit off the back of the computer case. But as you've seen inside of the model that we're using, all of the holes are like on a little mound, like a little pitcher's mound, if you will. So the motherboard just sits on those. So we're not going to need to use the riser fittings for this particular case. But different cases have a perfectly flat back, and that's where these little components here come in handy. Now we're going to position the motherboard so that all of the holes are lined up so that we can start to insert the screws, and then we're going to secure that motherboard to the back of the case by installing all of the necessary screws. Let's go ahead and see what that looks like.
Now the first component that I like to install in the case is the motherboard because it's the device that everything else connects up to. Now you'll notice that this is the back of the motherboard because we have all of the external ports here that are mounted on the motherboard. So we're going to line them up with the rear of the case. And we're going to make sure that each one of these is in their respective holes so that the motherboard is flush to the back of the case. Now you'll notice when it's flush that the actual holes that the screws go in are going to line up with the screw holes so that we can put them in. So let's go ahead and do that now. Now the screwdriver I like to use has a magnetic tip on it, which allows me to have a screw stay on the tip, and then I can go ahead and put a little pressure on the back of the motherboard while I'm lining the screw up with the hole. And then I just insert it. Now I don't tighten them all the way down because while I'm putting the different screws in, I want to have a little bit of ability to adjust the motherboard by pushing in on it. And then eventually I go back and I tighten them all down afterwards. Now I also like to do one on both sides, one on the bottom and one on the top, so that I have a little bit of security and stability front to back and top to bottom. And then I'm just going to go ahead and put all the rest of them in. So instead of making you watch me put all of these screws in, I'm just going to go ahead and do that, and then I'll get back to you and we'll join up again when I'm done.
Now that we've secured our motherboard to the back of the case by installing all of the screws, we're ready to now insert some of the different components that are going to be installed on the motherboard. And to begin with, we're going to install the CPU into its socket. So the first thing we need to do is locate the socket on the motherboard. Then we have to unlock it and open up the socket cover so that the socket itself is exposed and we can install the CPU. Then we want to orient the processor so that it's aligned properly. Once it's aligned properly, we're going to insert it into the processor socket, and then we're going to secure it by closing the cover and locking it down. Now that we've talked about it, let's go do it.
Now we're going to install the processor on the motherboard. The first thing we want to do is to identify the processor socket, which we have right here. And on this particular socket, we've got a locking lever, we've got a cover that holds the processor in place, and then beneath that is the pin grid array that the processor is going to make contact with. Now in order to get the processor mounted, we have to release this locking lever by pushing down on it, and then we can lift up on it. Once it's released, we can actually lift the cover to get it out of the way. Now what we want to do is we want to line up our processor, and down here on this bottom corner we've got our triangle, and that's going to be oriented down into this corner. So we're going to lay the processor into the pin grid array socket. We're going to let down the cover, and then we're going to lock it into place by pushing down on the locking lever. And that's all you need to do to install a processor into a processor socket. It's that easy.
Now let's take a look at installing RAM on the motherboard. In order to install RAM, first of all we have to locate the RAM slots on the motherboard. Once we've found them, we have to make sure that we orient our RAM over the slots so that the notches on the slots and the notches on the RAM sticks are lined up with one another. Then we're going to insert the RAM into the slots, and we're going to secure the RAM by pressing down on it and then making sure that the locking arms, which are the little nubs that you see here and on the other side, that they actually close up and lock down so they secure the RAM in place. Let's go ahead and install RAM.
Now when you're installing RAM, the first thing you want to do is locate where the slots are on your motherboard. These are our 4 RAM slots on this motherboard, and you'll notice that the locking mechanisms on some of them are white and on the other ones they're black. Since we're going to be trying to use dual channel capability, we want to install our RAM in both of either the white slots or the black slots. I'm going to use the white slots for this demonstration. So the first thing I want to do is open up the locking pins on both of them. Then I want to grab my RAM and I want to bring it in, and I'm going to line it up, and you'll notice that the notch here is lined up with the notch inside the socket. We stand the RAM up, and then you just come in with 2 thumbs and you give it a good push, and then the actual locking mechanisms will automatically close. Now we're going to bring in the second RAM stick and do the same thing. We're going to slide it into the socket, we're going to push down nice and firm, and then both of those are going to click into place. And you just want to give them a little push just to make sure that they really did lock in place so that your RAM doesn't come out. And installing RAM is that simple.
Now that we've installed our RAM, we're going to take a look at how to install the front-mounted USB ports. Now in this particular situation, our case has a unique way of doing it. This is the way that the manufacturer of this case has provided us with front-mounted USB ports. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to mount their USB frame onto the front of the case. We're going to secure it down with a single screw. Then we're going to insert the USB circuit board that actually has the ports on it into the frame. So we're going to be doing that from the inside of the case, and we're going to slide it in. Then we're going to secure that circuit board to the frame by inserting 2 screws. Once again, this is how this particular manufacturer has designed their case to provide us with front-mounted USB ports. Let's take a look at how we do that.
So here's the front-mounted USB port and the headphone jack that we're going to be mounting onto the front of the computer. And this is the cage that it gets housed in. Before we install the cage, we have to remove the board on here that actually has the USB ports and the headphone jacks, and we're going to set it off to the side. Then we're going to mount this onto the front. There's a couple of little flanges you need to get through the slots, and then slide it to the side. And this is the way this particular case is designed. You're going to notice that other cases have different ways of getting components mounted to the front. I'm going to go ahead and just lock this one down here so that it's perfectly secure. Then what we need to do is take this guy and we're going to slide it in the back. And you're going to notice we've got 2 holes here that screws can go in. So I'm going to go ahead and slide it in and get it lined up with the holes. And once we have it lined up, we're going to insert some screws through the top here. Here are our 2 screws. And again, I just love this magnetic screwdriver because without it, this would be just about an impossible task. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get that one in. And I'm going to cinch it down. There we go. And let me get the second screw in. And that way we've got a nice secured USB port. That way when you're pushing your USB ports in, they're not going to be sliding back and forth. And this will just take a couple of quick turns. There we go. There we go, caught the thread. Perfect. Now we've got our front mounted case with our USB and our headphone jacks, and we're ready to move on to the next component.
Now we're going to take a look at how to install a drive into a drive bay. Before we talk about the procedure that we're going to follow though, there's a couple of points I'd like to make. First of all, the types of devices that you install into a drive bay could be a parallel ATA or a serial ATA device. It doesn't really matter. The interfaces themselves are going to be on the motherboard. We're just talking about a place to house the component itself, so it doesn't matter whether it's PATA or SATA. Now, the types of devices that you might install in a drive bay might be a hard drive, or it could be a CD-ROM drive, a DVD player, a Blu-ray player, tape backup drives. Now, usually your drive bays give you front access, and you're only going to be using it for components that you need to have front access with, like a CD-ROM drive, for example. But sometimes manufacturers will give you adapter cages and allow you to install hard drives in those spots so that you could use them for putting additional hard drives in your computer system. The only difference would be that you would leave the drive bay cover on the outside of the case in its place, so it would block the hard drive because you don't need to see it. It's only an internal component. But in this particular case, just keep in mind that your drive bays, while they're mostly used for forward-facing or front-facing components, they may also be used for other devices like hard drives. Now here's the procedure that we're going to follow. First of all, if it's a PATA drive, a parallel ATA, or also known as an IDE drive, we first need to configure that drive as a master or a slave. And we talked about that in an earlier lesson. Now, if it's a SATA drive, a serial ATA drive, we don't have to do that. Now, once we've done that configuration, we're going to locate the drive bay and figure out which position within the drive bay we want to install that component. We're going to orient the drive so that the power connectors and the data connectors are inward facing, because that's not the part of the drive we want to face out. We want all that stuff facing in. Then we're going to slide the drive into the drive bay and position it properly, and then we're going to secure it to the case by installing some mounting screws. Let's go ahead and do that.
So the IDE or PATA device that we're going to be installing now is a CD player. Again, it could be a DVD player or a Blu-ray player. Now, since it's an IDE player, we had to set this to either master or slave, and it's the only device that's going to go into this computer that is IDE. So we set it to master. Now, in order to install it, we're just going to slide it into the external drive bay. Now, you're going to notice there's a screw already in the side here, and this is a nice little trick that we like to do. Since this particular case has a bowing front, you want to make sure that the front of the devices you're installing actually line up with the front of the case. So by installing that screw and sliding it in, it won't let it slide in any further than it should, and now it's going to be perfectly lined up with the front of the case. And it aligns up the secondary mounting screw that we're going to be installing here in order to lock it into the drive bay. And now we're going to go ahead and tighten that down, and now this particular device is firmly installed in the case, and we're ready to move on to the next component.
Now we're going to take a look at installing drives into drive cages as opposed to a drive bay. Now the big difference